All right. Thank you very much for joining our live stream today. Our subject is covering mining. We're titled under sustainable mining, whatever that might be defined. And we will be covering various aspects of the subject and look forward to you actually going ahead and sending us questions because our intention always is to make the sessions as interactive as possible. And although we are still currently waiting for one of the panelists, let me go ahead and show you who we have in store for today. We have Gabriella, who hopefully will be joining us here soon, who's a sustainability management and procurement compliance officer at the World Wildlife Fund. And then we have Osvaldo Coelho, who is a new business and investments manager at CJR Renewables. And then our close-up is Joshua Palfreman, who is a waste management specialist for the World Bank and a number of other organizations. So let me go ahead and welcome everybody. Thank you very much, Osvaldo and Joshua, for joining today. And I thought it would be, and I see that Gabriela is arrived on YouTube, but she has not arrived where we need to be. So we'll try to go ahead and figure that one out. No worries. Perhaps maybe if we can go ahead and get the conversation started. Osvaldo, you and I were I'm going to say the instigators, so to speak, of some of the things that we'll be talking about today. And there's a point that I raised to you about the idea of scarcity. And basically, you came back to me and you said, uh, don't believe the hype, Mike. This is not necessarily as it necessarily appears. So perhaps maybe if you'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about that. And I know that you have a slide that you would like to go ahead and show. So let me go ahead and put you in the spotlight. And perhaps if you can talk a little bit about the subject per.
Yeah, Mike. We are basically partners in crime, so to speak. Um, I'm not. I lost your sound from your side, but I can see the the chart that plots the historical copper reserves versus copper annual production. This not necessarily, of course, covers all the critical metals for the electrification of the economy, but it just to drive the point that I counterpose what you were saying. I challenge you what you said about, well, we are going to run out of uh, critical materials for the electrification of the economy, etc. And I use this data to show that consistently the copper reserves have been going up for the last 70 years, and you can see that at the bottom of it, the red showing the copper annual production. So it takes 70 years of the world economy encompassing the rebuild after the Second World War on the 50s, when Japan and Japan and Germany came back again, Marshall Plan, etc. Population grew to 7.8 billion today, and also the 60s, when the Cold War and emerging markets start growing, we can see that copper reserve kept growing. And although the copper production annually have been going up, it barely, we cannot say that made a dent on the historical copper reserves. And we can see that China came along, that gigantic last 30 years. And you can see in the last 30 years, copper production didn't go ballistic. So it can be the case that what we are looking into the uh, crisis story might not be exactly what is happening. So that's what I'm thinking, that how much of the metal crisis is actually true, and how much it is a story of the traders and the miners themselves. So how they are playing their commercial interests using the materials crisis. So that's what I wanted to say about this mining situation. Yes.
And so, would you say that the the situation specifically tied to our direction with regards to renewables is being used possibly as a vehicle to maybe come up with a quick profit?
Yes, you like we can say, not me, a Hong Kong Chinese friend of mine used to say, uh, deflate what I need and inflate what I have to supply, you know? So they are trying perhaps to inflate what they have. So um, I will make more profit from what I'm actually mining, instead of risking my capital, the miner's capital, into going into uh, expanding the copper annual production by opening the mines that are mothballed, uh, by going to talk with the governments where is difficult to get a deal to mine in a certain country because they want a lion's share of in terms of royalties. So then they are in their comfort zone, so to speak.
Yeah, we all know about comfort zone. I'd like to go ahead and make sure we get our other participants an opportunity. Gabriella, thank you very much for joining. The idea is that obviously we need to come up with different ways for us to go ahead and address these problems. And I believe, this is my personal opinion, that there are a lot of myths out there that we keep thinking that renewables are free. We believe that renewables do not require any minerals because they just kind of work on their own. And we do not realize that we still have the problem of mining, apart from the fact that mining is one of the most energy intensive sectors out there. And so, what I'd like to do is give our other panelists an opportunity to find some sort of niche with regards to some of these points. I know, Gabriela, from your perspective, you're looking at it primarily, not exclusively, primarily from the perspective of legislation. Based on our conversations, we were talking about the new EU legislations that were coming through, specifically tied to the supply chain. Perhaps if you can give us a little bit of information from your perspective, how you see the question of mining playing into that of what we have planned in the EU. And I should also mention that Gabrielle has been involved in the subject for a number of years, and so I was very happy to have her join us today. So perhaps, Gabi, if you would like to go ahead and tell us a little bit from your side. Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you. Yeah, in fact, and you just mentioned quickly the issue of renewables and all the raw material requirement for renewables, but it's also basically related to many other or some other EU policies, especially when it comes to e-mobility, for instance. And when it comes to the EU as such, we are a number of member states, and the topic, sustainable supply chain, both environmental and social sustainable supply chain, and the issue of basically the connected issue of sustainable mining is, I would say it's not a new issue. However, this sort of commitment of the EU that to take it at a higher level and to regulate at the level of all European member states as part of the regulation, that's still a new initiative. We had some, but especially when it comes to France, we had already a law in place that relate to due diligence along supply chain. Now we have a new law in Germany. It's very new law. It just came like a couple of weeks ago. It's officially called, again, due diligence in supply chains. And the EU itself, as you just said, is planning a new regulation that's supposed to come, as we all know, it might be not the final date. However, it's supposed to come by the end of or by early next year, I would say so. And when it comes to our topic today, mining and different kind of raw materials, I would also say that it's not only the only regulation or the only EU legislation that basically affects, that has an impact on mining, but also like other regulations that are already in place. For instance, the regulation that is just happened to be in place from the 1st of January this year, it's related to the mining of conflict minerals. And there will be, again, from 1st of January, but from next year onwards, from 2022, a new regulation on batteries, and especially specific raw materials that are, or that could be part of the batteries, and by that it can be also affect the policy of sustainable mobility or e-mobility. When it comes to specific elements of this supply chain regulation, of it's very hard to say at this moment in August what is going to be there at the end. However, if we see other countries like the German law that just came out in June, the French loi de vigilance that's already a couple of years old, and also some other legislations from Holland or from UK. But we can see in general so far in EU countries that most of the laws are related to social due diligence, social compliance, and some environmental matters that can cause at the end human rights violations. When it comes to the horizontal effect of this legislation, they mostly concern the direct suppliers of EU registered companies. That means that might be or most likely there is a political will and also a will from the civil society to tackle the whole supply chain as such from the beginning. However, it just when it comes to the law, to the hard law, it's not there yet, and therefore it's also important to consider not only this legislation, this regulation from the EU, but also the national legislation of those countries where basically these materials, raw materials, are coming from, at least at this point.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Osvaldo, you and I were having a conversation tied to the DRC and the artisans who are responsible for a vast majority of these materials that are being derived from the mines. And in fact, I think I saw something recently that the DRC actually came up with an agreement with the artisans. Do you know anything about that one?
Yes, there are two sides of the coin. One side touches what Gabriella is talking about, is coming to be a concern for the African governments to regulate the artisan mine, the ASM, the artisan small miners. South Africa already started doing something on that matter. In the case of DRC that I mentioned to you, the government wants its share of that sector, so that there aren't foreign interests that deal directly with the artisan miners, and that becomes a gray economy, because it has been a gray economy where the government has no control. It's basically artisan miners or the bosses of those artisan miners who deal with an exporter who puts in a container and ship it abroad. So that's the most concern of what the DRC government has been doing. Perhaps also as an indication that eventually they have to fall in line and regulate those minerals that they are going high and higher in prices. So they have a commercial interest on that. The Minister of Energy of the Minister of Mines of the DRC. So that's basically what happened in that respect there.
Okay,
Michael.
great. Thank you very much for that. Joshua, from your perspective, I understand that your focus is primarily on dealing with municipalities. To what degree do you see some sort of vortex between some of these subjects that we've been talking about so far and those things that you're dealing with?
Well, at the World Bank, when I think of waste management and recycling, I try and think of it more as this mining supply chain sector rather than an environmental cause, because I think that's a bit more realistic when you're talking about an industrial or a capitalist system. And with the brick and mortar mining that you guys are talking about, the most clear connection I can make is that construction and demolition waste management, for example, can act as a very easy substitute for the need to mine virgin raw materials. And this exists right across the municipal solid waste management stream, with whatever typology that you take out of your waste bin or out of a municipal skip or landfill. It usually relates more to a supply chain cause or a light manufacturing cause than it does to an environmental end. So if we take paper and cardboard recycling, for example, that's mostly being pushed by tissue paper, toilet paper, Soviet manufacturers who are looking for a more clean and cheap substitute for deforestation, which I would call raw mineral mining, right? And it would be the same thing with petrochemical firms. So it's been spoken about a lot. The maturity of kind of circular economy and waste recycling legislation in Europe is very good for things like plastic. And they'll start requiring companies to say, we want you to use 30 or 40% non-virgin recycled plastic resins in the manufacturing of new Coca-Cola bottles or in the manufacture of a plastic chair. But they undermine these own arguments. The Ministry of Environment will say we want 30% recycled content, but that the Food and Drug Authority won't allow recycled content in food and drug products or in products that come into contact with human beings. They'll also continue providing petrochemical extraction subsidies to oil companies, and not to pick a fight with the very powerful oil companies in the Western world. You can't be undermining a plastic recycling argument by providing petrochemical subsidies. Either you want people to use non-virgin petrochemicals, or you're subsidizing them to extract raw petrochemicals through unsustainable mining. And this exists kind of right throughout every type of typology I could take. Road construction and construction projects and topsoiling for landfills and landscaping projects for building parks requires huge amounts of aggregate, which can be produced through waste recycling and waste recovery operations of existing construction and demolition waste. But all of the subsidies, if you look at even EU governments, are on virgin extraction of raw materials, virgin materials from brand new items that are being mined out of a quarry. So with waste recycling, we're trying to allow a manufacturer to give a second life cycle, a second life to a plastic bottle or a piece of paper or a kind of big cement block that has fallen down from the building, which is being ripped apart. And if you're not providing the legislation and the economic and kind of incentives, and insurance companies, something that we haven't spoken about yet, but insurance companies also need to provide a lot of discretion for people to use recycled content, then you're undermining your own argument, which is your only kind of feasible approach to battle virgin first life cycle mining of raw materials.
I saw the whole time, Gabriella, you were ready, willing, and able to go ahead and respond to some of those things that Joshua was referring to. So I'd like to go ahead and give you the stage, if I may.
It's actually two comments, one from the policy side, another one from the legal perspective. And when it comes to the policy side, now in the EU, you might have heard this expression, we have this EU Green Deal, basically this policy instrument that aims a climate neutral EU at the end. And actually that was one discussion around the development of the EU Green Deal, the issue of mining, and how to make mining sustainable, how to make it more climate neutral at the end, and also socially sustainable. And that was a sort of like I wouldn't say target, but it was in the discussion at least to take mining closer to Europe, and it especially mean that take some of the mining activities that are possible due to the geographical reasons, obviously, and to mine specific raw materials that are possible here in different European countries. And that would be actually a very interesting topic, or maybe just for further research. What kind of impact, positive and also negative impact, would it mean to take some mining activities closer to the source, basically to the production at the end, or to the consumers? There was one aspect that I could connect this from the EU Green Deal, and another aspect that there's just a quick mentioning of the issue of circular economy. And in fact, I also, when I see legislation coming, different regulation, they are more and more focusing on environmental aspects. And this legislation that I just quickly mentioned, the regulation on batteries that is in force from next year, January, there has already, I would say, luckily, has at least one requirement that from 2027, specific electric vehicle batteries have to declare a content of recycled raw materials, especially when it comes to cobalt, lithium, and nickel. And as far as I know, there will be also a mandatory target for the recovery of materials from batteries in respect of cobalt, copper, nickel, and lithium, as far as I remember now. So there are some, at least even in the legislation, there are some aspects, circular economy aspects, that are already there. It's just like it comes in 2027. I mean, it's like in 6 years' time. So it might be not quick enough at the end, but we will see.
Could that be a situation where we have individuals or organizations that are being pulled by both ends, because depending upon whatever the subsidies may be or the legislation on the other, and they can't make anybody happy? Is there a possibility of that actually taking place? Any volunteers?
Well, if you legislate in this area and you give preference to recycled material, then you'll help those subsidy markets, those commodity markets, to raise value based on kind of supply and demand economics. If you undermine them by providing subsidies to the exact opposite, to the mining of virgin raw materials, then you won't. And it's interesting in the plastic space, which is getting a huge amount of attention right now. There's been a lot of good legislation in North America, in OECD and the EU, for requiring non-virgin plastic resins in the production of new line plastic products. And there are these companies like Plastic Bank and Thread, and they've actually trademarked the term social plastic. But if we can just use it anecdotally here, it's exactly the same thing that the Fair Trade Foundation did to bananas and coffee in the 1990s. And they just said, listen, this market can't survive by itself. The most successful recycling programs in the world of any type of commodity and any supply chain are heavily subsidized by public governments because they want to make their citizens feel good about themselves. But on their own merit and their own right, it's almost impossible to make money, with opportunity costs being and labor costs being as high as they are. So you need to provide some artificial prop up, and Fair Trade Foundation did that with bananas and coffee very good. It asked the upper middle class consumers in Europe and America to pay 5 cents more for a coffee. It used a very simple macroeconomic theory of ring fencing those funds, and then it subsidized beyond, the national legislated minimum wage in Nicaragua and Colombia what farmers would make. And it's exactly the same thing happening now with plastic and paper products, because you realize that even in developing economies like Kenya and South Africa, the waste pickers, even at an opportunity cost of something like $10 per day, don't see it worthwhile to collect the plastic because the commodity market for plastic is all over the place and too inconsistent for them. So you need to kind of create this artificial structure through legislation. You need to kind of provide a requirement for these markets to exist, because they won't exist naturally by themselves.
Oh, that is not a very promising situation if I look at it from face value. Does that mean that we've built this condition that is unescapable due to market forces, or where would we see as being the main derivatives of that? Any thoughts from any of you?
Michael, the way I look at it, is maybe you not explain directly or add to what Joshua was saying, but we need today this visible hand of the government to kickstart that thing, and once the legislation is in place and regulated, the thing takes a life of its own, right? That is today in the case of, say, plastic, right? But we can counterpose that to glass, aluminum, and copper, that we didn't need the government to step in and say we need to recycle those non-ferrous metals, or glass or paper, newsprint, etc. Because the economics of it, I'm thinking louder here, the economics of it was quite apparent, But in the case of plastic, where the economic motive to remove the trash from the environment by itself has never worked, and the growth was is visible everywhere, right? Because I can add, I live in Nairobi, and the more the income gets up, the more the people use plastics, and they don't dispose it properly, etc. So the tendency is this pile of plastic non-disposable properly to increase. So therefore, in this case, the government has to step in, or the visible hand, right, and push for a solution. First to slow it down, then eventually stop, and then pull that thing back. So that's how I can articulate the way I particularly see the situation. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that I need to give more credit to Osvaldo. Glass and metal can be smelted as many times as you're able to collect it. So if you have a competent collection system and you can aggregate it and get it to industry, they can keep on melting it and keep on making new glass bottles. You can't do that with petrochemical products and with paper. The contamination rate is too high. the integrity of the plastic breaks down, and petrochemical virgin resources are simply too cheap. So people would, a lot of petrochemical firms say, well, why would I want to collect plastic bottles from 10,000 different waste pickers and have a relationship with 10,000 different supply chain actors in Nairobi if I can just buy virgin petrochemicals for next to nothing? I mean, the barrel of oil has been so low for so many years, but when it was over $100 a barrel, I mean, the plastic recycling industry was doing extremely well, especially with more common polymers like PET and HDPE. So I'll give it to Osvaldo. Metal, and especially things like copper and glass. If you have a good return deposit scheme like they used to have in many sub-Saharan African nations, then you can just keep on making the same product again and again.
We have a question for the audience. We want to make sure that everybody's given an opportunity to go ahead and participate. How do we raise the awareness of interconnectedness and work on diluting power? We're back to our friends at Petrochemical. Move from ego profit to eco survival. I'd leave that to any of you who would like to go ahead and take it on.
Maybe just for the first part. Yeah, the second part I would do.
It's difficult, yeah.
Yeah, this interconnectedness. So this is exactly the topic that, as I see now, more and more organizations in the private sector, like NGOs, but also like public ones, like the EU and international organizations are doing projects in this system thinking mindset in general. And especially when it comes to specific policy topics like now the circular economy, and they are developing toolboxes, learning modules and so on to make people raise or make those sort of better abilities when it comes to system thinking, because exactly that's a point that it's a system where we are now, and it can be changed like any other system, from an ego profit to eco survivor system if we wish so. And this we, actually, I don't like to use the we in this sense, because the we means now everybody at some point who are on the board. And it's just like, the question is, how can we change this system in the most effective way? And obviously, if you just take the whole package as it is, then it's not going to happen. So that's if like parts of the system work together, it's a community, like at the local level or at the regional level, or as the cities or companies, like similar industries are working together, then it can create a system changes. And as far as I know, it's also mathematically speaking the correct way of changing systems.
I'll take on the second part. Because I think it's quite interesting, the words that were chosen to describe it, because we're talking about profit or survival, which are very drastic words, and they may or may not be relevant, or we might have different definitions, and we forget that we as human beings are always looking for one particular point, and that is, what's in it for me? And if we think that we can actually go ahead and ban that, then we are never going to make any progress. So the real question is, how do we come up with systems where the incentives are not destructive, but they're productive? And so for me, this is a system question. How do we go ahead and create better systems, which I think we've already alluded to, and the survival of the ecosystem, I think, is another one. Nature actually has done a pretty good job before we even showed up, and we keep talking about saving the planet. We're the ones that have to be saved. The planet will do fine even if we get to 6 degrees. So the real question is, how do we actually go ahead and build a symbiosis with nature? And I would actually go ahead and argue, can we go ahead and learn from them? So I had another comment. Let's go ahead and bring that to the screen. We are working with the EPP, Europe Plastic Pact, but unfortunately this topic was not covered yet. They are far behind. And I think that was tied to what both of you were talking about, Joshua and Gabriella, as far as perhaps some of the legislation. I realize that it's new, and I think certainly some of the challenges that are maybe not so apparent to various participants. The we shouldn't forget that the objective was to at least start from the perspective of mining. And of course, the whole subject of sustainable mining is a bit of a misnomer, because I think that the real question is, how do we actually go ahead and live within our boundaries? And I thought it was quite interesting how, Osvaldo, you got the conversation starting and saying that actually, if we talk about scarcity, that we have been, maybe if I can just go back to the slide that you were showing earlier, oops, go bring it back. Looking at the slide, in understanding that the capacity is there, and that very possibly we might be talking about possibly some manipulation, so to speak. But the point from my perspective is that we still need the energy to go ahead and perform the mining. We if we do not address other parts, for example, Joshua, what you were talking about as far as actually bringing these components into a system in a way that's actually financially sustainable, then the rest of this is not really going to make much of a difference, I would argue. So I guess the question to any of you, and please feel empowered to go ahead and jump in, is there a blueprint that we can actually go ahead and take up, apart from relying explicitly on legislation, that would be using a circular economy that might help drive this? And I think, Joshua, based on what you were saying, I think you probably have a couple cents to throw into that discussion.
Yeah, I really believe in legislation and macroeconomic policy. I don't think idealism and behavior change education is really going to get us to the goalpost. Unfortunately, I've become a lot more cynical about that. A really, really good example of macroeconomic policies forcing people to do the right thing is this comment. I don't want to kind of jump ahead of you here, but 20 euros back if your phone doesn't function anymore. That's a very, very popular argument right now, which is being discussed in recycling value chains. You're supposed to take people in macroeconomics who can definitely afford to pay more and charge them more, charge them an amount which is not going to not allow them to access the product, and ring fence that money for what the government wants to do. The next time you take an international flight anywhere in the world, this is to any of your participants, look down at the receipts. You're in the top 5% of global society. You're most likely very upper middle class, and you'll see about 30 different tax brackets that you're paying for, because they know they can tax you. They know, the government knows that you'll always be able to pay $5 more to take a flight from Paris to Barcelona or from London to New York City. And if you can afford the latest Macintosh Apple iPhone, you can most certainly pay a deposit of $100 that you're not going to get back until you kind of return that phone to an Apple retailer. That's an amount of money which is not going to get in the way of a very linear business model like Apple. It's the amount of money on a flight. If you forced people to buy the carbon offsets on flights, I think you would still find that business class travelers, the bread and butter of airlines' profit and business revenue, isn't going to go anywhere. And yet the government will have this enormous fund in which it can ring fence and start spending towards environmental decisions. Especially with recycling, it's so tedious, to have to ask people, take a peanut butter jar, for example. It has 4 different plastic typologies on it. It has this sticker, which you can never get off. You have to wash the peanut butter off the inside of your peanut butter jar. I don't believe in idealism in education. No one is going to do that at a scalable level. You need to figure out a way through macroeconomics and legislation to force people to do things, or to just not depend on them at all by creating ring-fenced finances that you can start spending on green investments and green technologies.
I see that somebody from the audience has a similar viewpoint as you, Joshua, coming up with a deposit system for e-waste, using that as an example. I do believe that there is something to be said about financial incentives. And so I think, Gabi, you wanted to go ahead and add something to that conversation, if I got it right.
So, yeah, I just read.
Oh, I can go back here. Here you go.
Thank you. It's a deposit system for waste mobile phone. You get to. Sorry, which question you mean? The deposit system, or that's what I see at least?
I think that's what you were alluding to, Joshua, right?
Yeah, charge people who can pay more money, and then ring fence the money to spend on green investments. That's the
I mean, just very quickly going back to this legislation, because legislation, what any legislation is doing in this whole world, they establish a mandatory minimum. It's not more, not less. It's a minimum level, and therefore I think they can be an effective tool to tackle those sort of challenges and to establish minimum of 20 euros or 30 euros, whatever they are, because then you have a baseline and everybody have to comply with this baseline. And this, at the end, ultimately, it can lead to a more fair competition between the different competitors, or between the different people at the end, because that's why legislation, basically what they are doing, they establish a minimum. And everything else what comes up to that is basically additional plus that doesn't necessarily need to be fulfilled. So therefore, especially when it comes to companies and circular practices or sustainable practices, therefore, even companies sometimes are lobbying for those sort of legislation, like now in Germany, even bigger industry companies, automotives, were lobbied for the sustainable supply chain law, because they exactly know that that creates a fair playing field between them and those in other EU countries, because everybody has to comply with the same minimum standards. It can be raised at some point. It should be raised, actually. That would be ideal. At least it's a good start. It's not the end. I would say this whole supply chain law is the start.
Osvaldo, I know that you have dealings throughout various regions in the world, including Latin America. How would the Latin Americans feel about that type of attitude, especially with European legislation?
Well, you see, how many bigger mines are in the world? I think like 20, 21. They dominate the mining sector, right? Anglo-American, Vale, Rio Tinto, BHP, and so on. So if we look to those big miners, they have their own governance towards legislation that affects their business, right? I think if you remember months ago, I told you could contact the lady from Vale, right? She was put in place. She was hired after Vale had a tailings dam that broke down and killed people and washed it away. So in that case, there are two ways. One is the tombstone, like the airlines. They only act when people actually die in an accident, right? And unfortunately, that will happen mining too. That only when there is a catastrophe, where casualties, and today with the media prominent as it is, and then they are forced to act. It should not be like this, right? That they should act. They should have their own people looking into that. Case in point, this governance that look into that. So now coming back to your question, I think those mines, they have their internal governance that they are looking to that, and they have the mechanisms to put in place and adhere to the law, right, and to the law and the regulations. So it can be a copper mine that has operation in Zimbabwe and in DRC and Zambia, and the same copper mine that has operations in Peru and Chile, right? So I think at this 20% of the companies that dominate 8% of the production, I think they recovered from there. Do I make sense to you or what I explained?
Yeah, they perform the law of averages and are able to go ahead and cover it in some fashion. That was my take.
Yeah.
that
The problem, sorry to interrupt you. The
No, no.
problem is really when you go down to the bottom of the barrel, when until you reach the incipient, this artisanal mining, that they now have an incentive to go and mine for copper. And now before they will dig maybe only 5 meters, now they go and they dig 10 meters. And more than 1.5 meter, you kill people if you don't brace, etc. Right? So there is an incentive. There is a price incentive, because let's say cobalt is more expensive. There is an incentive for this guy to run more risks, and that is where Gabriella explained that there must be traceability of that material, that eventually they will catch those pockets of people that are running a high risk of killing people. So that's where I think the biggest problem is, when you go down to the low tier 5 and 6 mining operations. So that's the way I look at it, Michael.
Well, and I think that's quite interesting, because what Gabriella was saying in describing the legislation coming from the EU, the focus, and please correct me if I have it wrong here, Gabriella, the focus is first starting with the social, which really goes in lockstep with that of what you were talking about, Osvaldo.
Yep, that's correct. I mean, mostly it's also not only this supply chain, but the supply chain legislation, but also other previous legislation from conflict minerals, not also to the batteries. It has a very strong focus on the social aspects, on human rights aspects, and negative environmental impact that could lead ultimately to human rights or social consequences. But that part, that like very typical topics like climate change, biodiversity, that might indirectly, and most likely indirectly, it will be linked to social consequences. However, just not in a few years' time. It might be a longer, or hopefully it will be. It can take longer to affect social the indigenous people, those who are living on that specific area. And maybe just one question to Osvaldo, because recently I read a case study related to the mine in Ecuador. And then I read this information. I didn't know that actually, that there is already a system in place how to conduct a human rights impact assessment before they are establishing a mine, any sort of mine in the region. However, there is no such as international standard that would establish a common practice for environmental impact assessment for these sort of to any mine basically that they are establishing. And it was also a difference between the social and human rights aspects and the environmental one, because for the one we have a standard, and for the other one no common standard, as I understood at least.
Yeah, that's exactly the point about the fair trade plastics that I was making earlier, that the optics of a banana and an espresso at a cafe are very clear to the consumer. But raw materials being mined in Ecuador and plastic bottles being picked up by waste pickers and turned into a petrochemical product, that's not an issue that most layman consumers would understand. They wouldn't understand what's happening behind the scenes in a mine in Ecuador. But with coffee and a banana, they have a very emotional, infatuatory connection with it at their corner cafe every day. And so creating that consumer awareness about things that aren't on the front line, aren't on the shelves at their local supermarket, they're actually in the back room or at the industry, is quite important.
Yeah, and it's also easier to understand, to let the customer understand that it has a direct impact at some point, at some time, and instead of focusing on biodiversity or climate change matters that might happen in 20 years' time. And obviously it's a complex issue.
We're improving the experience for the consumer. That's what we're doing. Sorry, that's what it is. We have a question coming from Franz Eder. How do you make such a deposit return scheme come to life, especially for cheap goods and materials? In Austria, for example, there is a huge lobby against it, plastic bottles, and I can only confirm that.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on this quickly. I saw that come in. So extended producer responsibility schemes are very often how government's trying to legislate against plastic and single-use waste. They write these documents in a very kind of vague way, and it's always meddled me. I'm not sure if they're doing it on purpose to protect the industries, or if they're just sitting in a room of social scientists and generalists who don't actually know how to legislate against this issue. What you must not say in an extended producer responsibility mechanism against plastic is stop wasting plastic, recycle 30% of it. And what you must do is, you hire a chemist and he comes in and he says, no plastic with more than 30% calcium carbonate in it, no opaque, non-transparent plastics, no plastics with multiple layers or ink which has been engraved into the life of the plastic bottle. There are going to be some people watching this program who have no idea what I've just said, but the industries that really need to change their harmful practices will know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you can put that wording in the legislation, you'll be specific enough that it actually makes a difference to what they're doing.
Yeah, that can be possible. That should be possible.
I think even for those individuals who might not necessarily been able to follow each piece of plastic that you described, Joshua, I think we know the complexity of the materials that we buy, and you gave a very good description when you were talking about the peanut butter jar, because basically that's what you were describing, all of the various components that are there. And in all honesty, for enough people, they don't need to bother, so they don't. And so it's coming up with an incentive from that perspective. I think we really have an uphill struggle.
Yeah, many times it's only a marketing instrument, basically.
You took the word marketing from my mouth. I have. You took. You say, how can we change people's perception? That's hard, but marketeers, they know how to do it. So when Joshua talk about the organic coffee and the attachment that a coffee drinker might have to a coffee produced in Costa Rica and versus another coffee produced in Brazil or Vietnam or Kenya, wherever, or Java, Indonesia. The marketeer, the user experience, the marketing, they are focusing today on the user experience. So you get that shining box that looks so sexy, etc., and then you open it, you put it to operate, and then that's the value that you paid for that iPhone, right? Or that Samsung phone, Android phone. That's the one I use. The marketing people, they create that user experience towards a brand new product that you just spend money into it, or persuading you to buy it for your girlfriend next birthday or so on. So that's nice to open somebody you like to open it. But if we think how a marketing person would try to sell that my old phone here is geared to be junked in 1.5 years, 2 years time, I don't know, that you are going to be a good citizen, a good person, not ego but equal guy or girl, who would responsibly dispose of this electronic junk, electronic waste that has lots of materials, and maybe not many of them can be reused and resold. That's where the marketing people, juices, would need to come up and say, how can we take that shiny new product and make it socially bound to the person, that you would drive it that person in 2 years' time to dispose it properly, like going to Samsung shop and put it in there. So that could be the marketing people uses to change that perception. So from the brand new that costs $500 to something that is a waste in 2 years' time. So I'm not a marketing guy to think how those things could play practically in a huge company like Huawei, Samsung, or which the bigger players in this field, you know. So
Josh,
it's a bit tough.
Joshua, Gabriella, do you think there's any hope to that of what Osvaldo was talking about?
I would say I see here definitely the importance again of circular economy, especially when it comes to the design, circular design. And just going back to what Joshua said before, especially when it comes to plastic, I also saw some good examples. However, they were not at the industrial usage for plastic bottles that are made out of a single plastic. So I also see and I also understand that it's possible to produce those sort of products out of a single plastic, and that type of single plastic that has the best life cycle quality, especially if it's getting recycled without these different parts that you should just explain. So it should be possible. It just has to have an awareness, this design, the importance of design and marketing.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I obviously all of these components that we're talking about, they all apply. That means that there's the lack of financial viability to actually go ahead and follow through. So you need to go ahead and build that into your system. I'd like to think, and maybe it's just the optimist in me, that there are enough people who would like to live sustainable. But I go back to the example, Joshua, you were talking about, that we make things so damn difficult in the way that things are constructed that it's almost impossible. You get to the point and say it's not worth the effort. Don't even talk about customer touch points and where companies saying what's taking place within my domain is fantastic, and they forget about the entire experience for the customers. And really that's what's the driver here. And so unless we're able to go ahead and concentrate on those right things and making sure that we understand what is the real problem, then tend to think there's going to be a bit of a struggle in actually making some progress. We are reaching the end of our program. I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to maybe give some closing words. And so perhaps maybe Joshua, if we can go ahead and start with you.
Sure. I guess closing arguments are just to think of recycling industries as the substitute for the need for raw material extraction. And then tax people who can pay more, who can afford to pay more, ring fence the funds, use that for green investments. And if you're going to penalize people through an EPR mechanism for single-use plastics, get a chemist on your board and penalize them where it actually hurts them. Don't just use kind of faffy, empty wording.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Maybe Gabriella, if I can give you the opportunity.
Yeah, my takeaway as well, that's how important hard laws like legislations are, and the importance and the role of the governments and their visible hand to regulate the market and to create a fair playing field for all actors who are working there, and also for companies who are producing these products we just talked about. So I think there is some hope, obviously, especially when it comes to the importance of circular economy and specific circular economy practices. It's just the question of timing. I would say we need some more speed when we would like to change this system.
I think with all these quotes, Adam Smith would be very proud of all of our conversations today. Osvaldo, if I can go ahead and leave the last words to you.
I don't know if Milton Friedman would like, Milton Friedman of Free to Choose, he would like to hear about us because he didn't like the visible hand. But of course, we progressed since the times of Milton Friedman, which was in the 80s. So we have new social conventions. Well, when we listen to people like this panel, uh, I'm convinced this is hard. Then it's really hard. It's not easy. If it would be easy, it would have been done already. So it's hard to deal with that. But at the same time, we look to what Gabrielle told us. He say, okay, there are difficulties, but there is hope because people are talking about and using our minds to try to dig ourselves out of this hole that we ourselves or people on the past created. So um, we have a new deal to tackle, and we know that is not going to be like empty words, like George was saying, and like Gabriella says, it's not legislation only. We need the people to buy into it, because eventually that pressure that comes from the population in general helps that to move ahead, right?